World War II became global, not at the moment when the first armies crossed borders, but when death stopped distinguishing between the front line and home. That is why it still sounds not like a historical fact, but like a warning. It took more than 70 million lives and turned civilians into the main targets, even if no one officially admitted it. "We are not fighting," a woman said as she covered her windows with paper instead of glass. "We are just living. And somehow, that is what we are being punished for. Bombs don't fall on soldiers, they fall on kitchens, hospitals, and schools. I don't understand when life itself became a crime. Cities burned just like battlefields. In this war, there were no safe places left. If before war came to the soldier, now the soldier came into the city with the war. Civilians found themselves inside a conflict they never chose, yet paid the highest price for. They called us the rear," an old man said among the ruins. But there was no rear anymore. Death came from the sky, from hunger, from camps. It didn't ask whether you held a weapon or held a child's hand. World War II did not only destroy armies, it destroyed the very idea of protected civilian life. Mass bombings, genocide, and total mobilization turned entire societies into targets and people into numbers, convenient for reports and plans. "We became part of statistics," a woman whispered while standing in a bread line, "long before we understood that this war wasn't about victory, but about survival, and that sometimes civilians had fewer chances than soldiers on the front line." This is where the story begins, because the deadliest war in human history was terrifying, not only because of the scale of fighting, but because it carried a brutal truth to its conclusion. In a world of total war, civilians are no longer bystanders, and when millions die without weapons in their hands, war can no longer justify itself by any idea other than raw, merciless force. Death in this war learned to operate on an industrial scale, methodical and deliberate, not as a byproduct of battle, but as an instrument of policy. That is why the number of the dead grew not only on the front lines, but in camps, in food lines, in windowless train cars where people died before the world ever learned their names. "They are taking us somewhere to the east," a woman said quietly, holding her child as if her own arms could protect them. "They say it's temporary, that it's for our safety, but no one ever comes back. And I feel these words are no longer about rescue, but about an ending." Starvation became a weapon no less effective than tanks. Cities were taken not only by sieges, but by exhaustion. And when people collapsed from weakness, it did not look like combat losses. Yet, in scale, it equaled entire battles, only without flags or victory reports. "We are not fighting an army," a man said, staring into an empty bowl. "We are fighting emptiness, and it wins more quietly than bullets, because when you die of hunger, no one writes about you as a hero." Death camps functioned like factories, where human life was measured by throughput. Here, civilians ceased to be collateral damage. They became the target. The destruction of people based on origin, faith, or language was part of the plan, not a tragedy of war. "We are no longer people," someone whispered in the barrack. "We are numbers, and if we are erased, it will not change the course of the battle, because the battle is no longer at the front. The battle is for the right to exist." Even those who survived lost everything. World War II shattered families, erased cities from maps, uprooted entire nations. Civilians died not because they were near the war, but because the war came for them deliberately. "I don't know what we are being punished for," a woman said with an empty gaze. "But if most of the dead are people like us, then this war did not go off the rails. It means it was designed this way." And here the second act reveals its terrifying essence. The deadliest war in human history became so not only because of the scale of battles, but because it turned civilians into a resource of destruction, pushing the idea of total war to its extreme, where the death of millions without weapons in their hands was not a mistake, but a cold calculation. Gradually, the world began to realize that this war had no limits, because the limits disappeared along with moral restraints, and even those who had justified violence as necessity only yesterday now looked at the scale of destruction with a horror that could no longer be hidden behind words like strategy or victory. "We have gone too far," an officer said, looking at casualty lists where civilian names took up more space than those of soldiers. "But if we stop now, we will have to admit that all these millions died for nothing. And that would break not only the front, it would break the entire worldview this war is built on." Civilians no longer waited for protection. They waited only for an end, any end, because living in constant fear turned out to be worse than dying quickly, and that thought was a terrifying sign of how deeply the war had penetrated the human psyche. "I am not asking for victory," said a woman who had lost her home and family. "I am only asking for this to stop, because if this is called a fight for the future, then I do not want such a future built on our bodies." Even those who survived the camps, the bombings, the blockades came out of that hell as different people, because the war left behind not only ruins, but an inner silence where trust, faith, and a sense of meaning used to be. "We survived," said a man with an empty stare. "But I do not know how to live on knowing that the world allowed this to happen, that millions of civilians disappeared not by accident, but because their lives became bargaining chips. Governments spoke of a turning point, of a coming end, but for people on the ground those words sounded as hollow as before, because they had heard them too many times, and every time another wave of death followed. "The end does not matter," someone said in a crowd of refugees, "if all that remains afterward is silence and shame, because then this war will have won even after the guns fall silent. And it is here that the fourth act reaches its limit, because the deadliest war in history showed not only how many people the world can kill, but how much truth it is willing to endure about itself, when it becomes clear that civilians were not an accidental victim, but the center of the tragedy, and that after this it is no longer possible to return to the old idea of war as the business of armies without lying to ourselves." When the guns finally fell silent, the world did not feel relief, because the silence after the Second World War was too loud, filled with empty cities, mass graves, and questions without answers. No victory could outweigh the fact that more than 70 million people would never speak another word. "We survived," a woman said, standing among the ruins. "But I don't know if that means we won, because if most of the dead were civilians, then who exactly did this war save, and what was it really for?" The world began counting crimes, creating courts, writing conventions, as if trying to mark a line that must never be crossed again. But even these attempts felt late, because millions of lives had already become proof that humanity is capable of going further than it ever believed possible. "This must never happen again," politicians said, looking at photographs of camps, destroyed cities, and exhausted survivors. "We have learned the lesson. We understand where total war leads." But those who survived knew the real lesson was not in documents or dates, but in a simple and terrifying truth. A war in which civilians make up the majority of the dead is not a malfunction of the system, it is its logical outcome. When the line between the front and the home disappears, so does any justification. "They didn't kill us because we were fighting," a man said quietly. "They killed us because we were there, and that turned out to be enough for the world to accept our deaths." The memory of the Second World War became the foundation of a new fear, but also a new responsibility. Because if the world forgets how easily civilians became the main target, history will repeat the same scenario, only with different names and different cities. And in this final moment lies the core responsibility, because the deadliest war in history did not truly end when the last act of capitulation was signed. It ended only when the world agreed to admit this. No ideology, no victory, and no flag is worth millions of civilian lives. And the moment this stops being obvious, war becomes possible again.